Today I've been asked to talk about the community impact of racing from a government perspective. And I'm happy to do so because in Victoria, the state that I was Premier of, a state with an economy, by the way, the size of Singapore, bigger than Ireland or Israel, in our state, political support for racing has always been overwhelmingly bipartisan. And indeed, in the 1980s, when I was in the National Parliament, when Bob Hawke was Prime Minister, Bob Hawke, as Prime Minister, was a great supporter of racing, and his counterpart, the Leader of the Opposition, Andrew Peacock, was also a great supporter of racing. When I was Premier in Victoria, my Deputy and Attorney General was also the Minister for Racing, and I'd note that under the current government of Victoria, the portfolio of racing is held by the Premier himself. So my remarks today will look at racing's capacity to make a significant contribution to public revenues, to employment, economy, society, and I'll do that with a particular focus on what I'd call major racing events. And I'll also touch briefly on some of the policy issues that arise in connection with racing and on which I believe governments in Australia and perhaps around the world have strong views. And if I start with my country first, my country's love affair, as you know, with racing is very strong and very long-standing. More than 100 years ago, that was Mark Twain's famous Melbourne Cup quote. The Melbourne Cup and the associated Spring Racing Carnival today have become even more important from an economic and community perspective. And the reach of the event, national and international, and across the tourism, hospitality, fashion and media industries, I would describe as immense. But more generally, Australian racing today spans both the calendar and the continent. 389 race clubs hold 20,000 races each year, and the industry also supports a thriving export sector. For many rural and regional centres, their Cup Race Day remains one of the most significant events on the community's calendar, normally marked, by the way, by a public holiday. The provincial city that I represented in the federal parliament enjoys, as I said, a public holiday, has done every year for the running of the Bendigo Cup. Stepping back to the international scene, racing is well established in every inhabited continent. Globally, the industry generates wagering turnover of 94 billion euros. It's got total global attendance of more than 100 million a year. Indeed, as you probably know, there is a horse race somewhere in the world every 3 minutes. An activity on this scale is a substantial economic enterprise, and the capacity of racing to generate significant public revenues is plainly of interest to governments. In Japan, the Japan Racing Association contributes 10% of its turnover and half of any surplus profit. In 2013, this amounted to US $2.5 billion. In terms of charitable donations over and above this, in 2011, the JRA generated US $57 million to help the people and communities that were so terribly affected by the Japan earthquake and associated tsunami. Here in Hong Kong, as we know, the Jockey Club is the largest single taxpayer, contributing 7.4% of annual fiscal receipts in financial year 12-13. And of course, as we've just heard from the Minister, the Secretary for Welfare, Matthew Chung, on top of this, the Hong Kong Jockey Club made a $2.9 billion contribution to charity in 2013, and this is an annual occurrence. Last night I was able to be at the opening dinner, and I thought the video that was shown there of all of the activities, the reach of those activities around Hong Kong was a great example of the great public good which those funds are put towards. The extent to which it's possible for racing to make a direct financial contribution to the community on this scale is obviously a function of the model for racing and wagering which each respective country has in place. And I think this should be particularly noted by those countries in the region which are just starting down the path of developing racing. Also noteworthy from the slide behind me is the substantial attendance figures. And in Australia, by the way, racing ranks second only to the AFL in public attendance. In the UK, racing is second only to football. And here in Hong Kong, racing comfortably takes out first place. And this leads me to the issue of racing's capacity to stage successful major events. And I want to focus my remarks particularly around Victoria's Spring Racing Carnival and the Melbourne Cup, the race that stops the nation. I don't know how much of the detail of that slide you'll pick up, but I thought it told a story. It was in our national newspaper, the Australian Financial Review, and it was a full-page advertisement placed more than 7 months before the Cup Carnival. It highlights, I think, the scale and the economic reach of the event in Victoria and Australia. But it also serves to highlight the growing importance of major events to the economic and social life of cities around the world. In addition to providing great entertainment, major sporting and cultural events also bring notable economic, livability and reputational benefits to the cities and the regions around them. And I think the Spring Racing Carnival, the Melbourne Spring Racing Carnival, is a great example of this. Every year, as you know, the very best thoroughbreds from Australia and around the globe descend on Melbourne for what is a world-class celebration of horse racing that lasts for more than 60 days. The event transforms Melbourne as a whole, bringing the city to life with its carnival atmosphere. It is a celebration that captivates the nation. And if you ask any Melburnian what the Spring Racing Carnival represents, you're likely to hear about much more than just the horse racing itself. You'll hear about flowers and fashion and food and wine and hats and hotels, and the list goes on. The carnival begins in August. It includes more than 100 race meetings. It culminates in the Caulfield Cup, the Cox Plate, recognised as the Weight for Age Championship of Australasia, and then, of course, what I'd call the quadrella, Derby Day, Melbourne Cup, Oaks Day and Stakes Day. Every year, of course, on the first Tuesday in November, Australia comes to a standstill as more than 100,000 people converge on Flemington for the Melbourne Cup. This year, more than $6.2 million Australian will be on offer as prize money, making this the richest handicap race in the world over its length. The Cup became a global event in 1993, with horses now competing from all over the world. And of course, 2010 marked the 150th anniversary of the event. I think, for those of you who haven't been there, and I know many of you will, but words can't really explain the excitement that builds through the carnival. And on Cup Day, it is true to say, as I said, that the nation literally stops at 3 p.m, and just about everybody you know in your street or at your workplace has a bet or a wager on the race. Political leaders also offer up their tips with differing levels of success, which are widely publicised. In the 1990s, when I was Leader of the Opposition, I developed quite a following after successfully tipping 3 successive winners in Doremus, which was 1995, Saintly, 1996, Bart Cummings, and then, of course, Might and Power, 1997. But I did lose form for a few years and had to wait till Mackay Diva got me back on the winner's saddle. As Premier and Treasurer, I always attended the Melbourne Cup, Derby Day, Cox Plate, and usually the Caulfield Cup. And I did so to show my support for an industry that's vital to Victoria's economy and to our livability. And I also attended many of the provincial cup meetings, the Bendigo Cup and the Coleraine Cup, a little town of just 1,600 people in these areas, which is where my family comes from, because in these areas, these events were so important to the local community. I want to make this point. In a world that I think is hungry for content and live events, it's important to put the Spring Racing Carnival in the broader context of major events. I'm sure that many of you will have visited Melbourne, perhaps for the Spring Racing Carnival, maybe the Formula One Grand Prix in March, the Australian Tennis Open in January, or perhaps for Melbourne Winter Masterpieces at the National Gallery of Victoria. The value of these events however, is not just in the entertainment and the life, the bounce, if you like, that they give to a city. Each of these events contributes to Melbourne's excellent international reputation, and each generates important additional benefits that in turn fuel a cycle of social and economic success. And from a government perspective, it's the direct and the indirect economic, livability and reputational benefits that really signal their worth. And by the way, you'll see from that slide there again just the scale of the Spring Racing Carnival. Some broad statistics highlight the economic benefits quite powerfully. The myriad of events that Melbourne hosts each year is worth about $2.5 billion to our local economy. The events bring in 300,000 visitors to our state. They all require food, wine, accommodation and so on. And for an economy in transition like ours and many others around the world, with fewer jobs in traditional things like manufacturing, this activity represents a major driver of new jobs and opportunities. Let's have a quick look at the specific value of major events, and particularly the Spring Racing Carnival. In 2012, the Carnival attracted an overall attendance of more than 700,000 people. The total direct spending was $330 million. The gross economic benefit with the multiplier effect was more than $600 million. This is the figure, I think, that really tells the story of the Carnival's value. It's the gross amount of spending, including the flow-on impacts generated throughout the whole Victorian and Australian economy. And by the way, this figure of more than 600 million was 7.2% up on the previous year, and it made 2012 the third consecutive year with growth in excess of 5%. And I think the gross economic benefit indicates just how valuable the Spring Racing Carnival is to Melbourne, to Victoria, to Australia, because it includes the many economic benefits that are associated with race attendance. For instance, the Carnival is directly responsible for significant tourism impacts. Of those 700,000 attendees, almost 1 in 4 were from interstate or from overseas. Many of these people travelled to Melbourne just for the event. And interposing, if I can for a moment, the same tourism impact that we see in Victoria from racing can be seen in many other countries. For example, in Vintage Crops, country of origin, an estimated 80,000 people a year travel to Ireland to go to the races. And here in Hong Kong, a Wednesday night at Happy Valley Racecourse is, of course, a major tourism drawcard. And returning, if I might, to the Spring Racing Carnival, each tourist stayed for an average of close to 4 nights and generated more than $35 million in accommodation spending. Racing in Australia, as elsewhere around the world, is also inextricably linked with fashion. In 2012, racegoers spent more than $50 million Australian on fashion items to wear to the Carnival, representing an increase of nearly 8% on the previous year. I mention these figures to highlight that a major event has both direct and indirect economic impacts. But adding to all of this, there's also an important ongoing benefit associated with major events, and that's livability. As events deliver economic benefits, this has the flow-on effect of generating jobs, attracting business and investment, and encouraging new people to settle. In time, these factors all enhance the success of major events. They encourage new events and new content to emerge, all of which adds to a city's social and economic success. And thus, I think major events are important, not just because of the financial impact that they bring, but also because of the role that they play in creating a prosperous cycle of advancement. And it's one of the reasons, by the way, that Melbourne has now been crowned the world's most livable city for the 3rd time in a row. In the last 15 years, we've never been out of the top 3 cities in the world. And I think Melbourne's consistent performance in this regard is a reflection on our long-term commitment to building livability. And if you think about livability, it's not just important to citizens at a point in time. in a world where, as we know, the movement of capital and people is increasingly mobile, the world's most livable cities tend to attract highly capable professionals and small business owners. They're looking not just for economic opportunities, but they're looking for the best quality of life. And this really brings me to my final point about major events. Major events can also help raise the profile of a city and sustain its reputation across the world. And clearly, if you look at our example in Victoria, Melbourne benefits from its title as the world's most livable city. And by the way, we also benefit from being the world's ultimate sports city, which we won 3 times in a row, 2006, 2008 and 2010. And if you think about a city like Melbourne, we don't have a Great Barrier Reef, we don't have a great harbour. Livability and global reputation is vital to attract people and capital. So let me conclude on these remarks. What does our experience with major events mean in the context of the rise of Asia? We all know the story, I think, of the rise of Asia. Asia as a whole currently counts for the majority of global economic growth. By 2025, Asia will constitute half of the world's economy. And of course, in China, within a few short years, China will be the world's largest economy. It will be the largest creditor. It will have the largest share of global trade. And the result of all of this growth is that in Asia is that 1/3 of the world's population are now re-engaging with the global economy, and billions of people, literally, have had their quality of life dramatically improved. And moreover, as we know, in China and India, elsewhere around the world, we're seeing a huge growing middle class that comes with that development. For example, up to 500 million people in China will enter the middle class over the next decade. And so this is an exciting time for Asia, because as incomes rise, so too will demand for new products, new goods and new services. And in particular, we'll see increased demand for previously less accessible services like sporting and cultural entertainment, including experiences such as horse racing. And in this environment, the rise of Asia is good news for the Asian Racing Federation and the racing industry more generally. And for governments, there's a great opportunity to oversee the responsible growth of this industry. It's always been my view that a prosperous and responsible racing industry is an important element of a civil society. And if you think about it, racing essentially operates through government fiat, with race days, regulations, public holidays, the ability to wager, all of these things established by government. And that leads me to consider from a government perspective some of the more pressing policy issues which are currently associated with racing. And the first of those goes to the heart of racing's financial viability, namely the need for robust mechanisms to ensure that racing can capture a fair proportion of the economic opportunity it generates as a medium for wagering. In 2005, the Victorian government, of which I was then the Treasurer, the Finance Minister, amended the Gambling Regulation Act to make it an offence for a wagering operator to use racing information without the approval of the relevant racing control body. This was the first instance of what has become known as Racefields legislation. Submissions from the Australian Racing Board and the respective Principal Racing Authority progressively saw similar legislation adopted right throughout Australia. And as we explained in the Parliament, and I quote, "There is a basic principle which says that the owners of the racing product should derive a benefit from any bets placed on that product." The statutory measure was subsequently validated by the High Court of Australia. And I mention it today because it may serve as a useful model for other jurisdictions who face a similar issue. The need for Racefields legislation arose because of the substantial changes in the composition of the Australian wagering market, with an influx of new entrants, a field of corporate bookmakers and one betting exchange. Another aspect of this development was the dismantling of state-based restrictions on the advertising of gambling. This was triggered by a constitutional challenge brought against Western Australian legislation by the Australian arm of the UK company Betfair. And with the dam walls broken, if I can put it that way, free-to-air television was literally flooded with wagering advertisements. Betting odds were juggled with match scores during sports broadcasts, and ad breaks urged watchers to open up new bookmaker accounts. The community backlash to this was pretty swift, it was pretty strong. A new national code has now been put in place which bans live odds advertising during television and radio broadcasts of sports matches. Broadcasting of racing events have been granted an exemption from this ban, and the grounds for this, I think, are well accepted. However, the circumstances serve to illustrate a salutary point. Governments have got an obligation to strike the right balance between the benefits that can flow from gambling-related activity and any social costs that might flow. Self-regulation, I think, has worked in the case of racing. Your industry has been seen as acting responsibly. But my advice would be that you need to be ever conscious of the trust that is placed in you. In the same vein, your approaches to integrity, to anti-doping and to animal welfare must be of the highest possible standard. The attention to the use of anabolic steroids, sparked by a high-profile case in the UK last year, and the recent exposure of doping and animal cruelty within the US have posed, I think, significant challenges to the industry's reputation in those parts of the world. My government had confidence that the racing control body in our jurisdiction, Racing Victoria Limited, took its responsibilities for these matters very seriously. And I note that it spends some $15 million Australian annually on integrity, drug testing and stewarding. I'm also aware that the other Australian racing jurisdictions and the Asian racing federations, other major racing countries, share this commitment, as does your international federation and many of its members. And I encourage you today in my remarks to maintain this commitment. It is costly and at times it can be challenging, but the public and government, whose job it is to protect the public interest, will not accept anything less. So finally, racing is a time-honoured sport which has developed as a significant aspect of the economy and the societies of a great number of countries around the world. If I'm asked to sum up the community impact, I would say that it is overwhelmingly a beneficial one. And this is a bipartisan political view in Australia. And by the way, it would seem to me that it's also an international one. And I note that in the case of Turkey, its most famous political leader, Mustafa Ataturk, said that, and I quote, "Horse racing is a social need for modern societies." And so looking to the future, as incomes in Asia continue to rise, governments will put in place broad strategies to capitalise on the economic, livability and reputational benefits that come with major events. And as in Melbourne and Victoria, I believe that racing and racing events can be a key element in this development. And in that sense, I wish you every success with your growth, expansion and endeavours. Thank you.